Nice to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here on a rainy Saturday. If you were at the talk before that Hunter ably moderated, that was talking a lot about sort of what happens inside the Google Doc when it comes to art criticism. And we're going to talk about what happens outside the Google Doc. Before the Google Doc begins, after it ends, and everything on the perimeter. So I want to start by thanking Nada and Schwartzman and for hosting us, and introduce myself. My name is Julia Halperin. I am a freelance journalist. Until the end of last year, I was executive editor of ArtNet News, and I'm also the co-founder of the Burns-Halperin Report, which is a data-led examination of representation in museums and the market. So I want to start out by finding a little bit more about who you are and who is here. So raise your hand if you have written or edited for an art publication before. All right. I have a couple more, but raise your hand if you've been written about in an art publication before. Okay, great. And how about if you've sold advertising or worked with an art publication as a publicist? Hey guys. Great. So now we have a sense of our audience. And Hunter kind of referenced this earlier, but I can't think of a better way to kick off this panel than just to kind of explain where we are. So we're talking about new models for art media inside the offices of an art advisory at a panel organized by an art fair in conjunction with a journal founded by a communications firm. So we are not in traditional art media Kansas anymore. Art media has transformed fundamentally over the past decade in ways that are sometimes similar and sometimes very different from media at large. The public's interest in art has in some ways grown as it has intersected more with pop culture and high finance and tech. And at the same time, places to publish journalism about art have dwindled. So major newspapers have cut full-time art critic positions. Smaller outlets like Even an Elephant have shuttered, as have critical journals published by museums like SF MoMA and the Walker Art Center. And Art News now has one print issue per year, and Art in America has reduced its run from 8 issues to 4. So where do we go from here? That is the question we are here to answer. If we agree that art publishing is important, and I'm going to take it as a given based on the fact that people came here in the rain on a Saturday, that we do, how do we keep it alive? What models work? How do we pay for it? How do we keep it relevant and meaningful? And those are the questions that I want to dig in today. So I can think of no better group to discuss this than the panelists we have right here, who I will introduce now. So to my far left, Brian Droitcour is a critic, editor, and curator. He has contributed to publications including 4 Columns, Art Forum, and Rhizome, and catalogs for exhibitions at the Whitney Museum and the Art Gallery of Ontario. From 2014 to 2021, he worked at Art in America magazine. He is now editor-in-chief of the digital art platform Outland. In the middle, we have Alison McDonald, who joined Gagosian in 2001 and is the gallery's chief creative officer. During her tenure, she has shaped every aspect of the gallery's extensive publishing program and oversees the publication of as many as 40 books per year. That blew my mind. She's also editor-in-chief of Gagosian Quarterly magazine and spearheads the concept, planning, and development of Gagosian's online sales platforms. And to my immediate left, we have Jessica Lynne, a writer and art critic. She is a founding editor of Arts.Black, an online journal of art criticism from Black perspectives. Her writing has been featured in publications such as Art Forum, The Believer, Freeze, The Los Angeles Times, and Oxford American, where she is a contributing editor. She is a student of MFA writing at Sarah Lawrence and newly minted associate editor of MOMIS. Welcome. Thank you for being here. So you all established publications that you lead or have led in response to some kind of gap in the existing media landscape. So I'm going to ask each of you what that gap was that you had identified. And let's start with you.
Sure. So Arts.Black emerges in 2014 when my dear friend and collaborator Taylor Aldridge and I, and maybe like a fit of rage, a fit of naivete, a fit of optimism, looked around and saw that most of the kind of dominant mainstream art publications weren't necessarily publishing Black writers. And we thought, well, if they weren't going to do it, we would do it. So Arts.Black kind of comes out of that spirit. I think for us too, as young people then trying to figure out our work as writers, we also understood ourselves in a lineage of Black writers, right? We are children of the hip hop age, so we've been reading folks like Danielle Smith, Greg Tate, Joan Morgan. You know, we had been reading folks like Margot Jefferson, Tulani Davis, who for me is a bit of a hometown hero, right? So we also knew that, and we're learning from Black writers who had preceded us, that we always had something to say about the culture that we were also deeply informing, even if maybe a dominant visual arts media apparatus wasn't necessarily employing us in the way that these other kind of cultural modes and markets were. So we started a thing on Tumblr, very unsure of what it would do, but sure that it was important to do nonetheless. And so here we are, almost 10 years later, many lessons learned, many mistakes made, but I certainly don't think either one of us have any regrets about it.
And Alison, what about you? What was the origin story of Gagosian Quarterly?
So the gallery's been making books since 1986, and we had a robust publishing team. And we have 19 galleries all over the world and probably about 100 artists that we represent. And we were often trying to get the artist stories into the world, and we were facing limits. And we were quite well equipped to be able to tell the artists sort of behind the scenes or in the studio ourselves based on our own in-house team. And so we were really trying to come up with something that would be interesting in the landscape, the media landscape. And our approach was that, you know, art isn't made in a bubble. And we really wanted to bring in music and literature and dance, legacy questions. And so it was in some ways trying to decide what we could bring to that sort of current landscape, but also what we were sort of uniquely positioned to be able to do from an editorial point of view.
And it's interesting to me, you mentioned that, you know, around this time you also, because you also buy advertising for the gallery,
Yeah.
you noticed that there were also just fewer publications to even place advertising in, let alone have the, you know, work with them to tell the stories of your artists.
Yeah, I mean, we kept sort of running into this, as you said, I mean, this problem where there's not that many magazines out there. I think that, you know, and magazines are struggling. And I think the kinds of stories they're going for are often gripping headlines and very short content. And that's not the same context that the artist needs to bring their work to the world. And I think that we were having a little bit of a hard time getting, and there's so many stories that can be told over any single exhibition. And so it's really nice to be able to, you know, our artists often get press on the shows, but what we're doing is sort of a different storytelling for them.
And Brian, what about you? What was the sort of gap that you saw that Outland came out of?
So Outland is a platform for digital art that commissions artist projects that are released as NFT editions, and we also publish an online magazine of criticism about digital art. I've been in the art and tech space for a long time. I worked at Rhizome from 2008 to 2012, and I've written a lot about art and the internet and social media. So in 2021, when the NFT market exploded, I was seeing artists who I'd known for a long time, who'd always been doing really interesting stuff with digital media, were suddenly having markets for their work in its native medium that they'd never had before. And so I thought this would be a really exciting time when there would be more critical attention to that kind of work. But most of the coverage of NFTs and digital art in both the art press and the mainstream press was really focused on auction prices, these crazy sales that were happening, and they really weren't writing about interesting things that artists were doing with the medium. So I was working at Art in America at the time. I wrote a few articles that were trying to focus more on the art. And then later that year, I was approached by the founders of Outland, who had this idea for a platform that would have a strong editorial content and really do more to fill that gap in terms of thoughtful coverage for digital art. So.
And speaking of money, I do want to talk about money now. It's interesting to me that all three of you, and this was really intentional in putting together this panel, you work for outlets that are not advertising based. Advertising has been the engine that has powered media in general and art media for a very long time. And the problem with art media specifically is that the audience is generally too small for something like, a New York Times style paywall to work, because you'd have to charge really high prices to make it work. And it's also kind of too small for individual Substacks because, again, you can't charge an exorbitant amount of money for one person, and there just aren't enough people who want to pay for it. And so, I want to talk to each of you about kind of the different business models that you have and sort of how they inform the work that you do and have done. So Jessica, I want to start with you. Art.Black was self-funded until you began getting funding from foundations. Tell us about what that experience was like and what it enabled you all to do.
Yeah, self-funding is really hard. I mean, we were broke. We didn't have any money. We were working New York and Taylor, Detroit, respectively, at nonprofit institutions, also not paying us a lot of money. But I think what we thought was okay, we know we have a great idea. We know that we have an infrastructure and an architecture that many of the very people who we want to read would appreciate, right? So I don't even know if we started with an idea that this would make us money or be a profit-generating venture. I think we just said, we have the internet, we have this idea in this domain, let's get it up. Eventually, through many conversations with folks much smarter than ourselves, we also realized that there was a certain kind of business model that we actually had to attend to. How are we gonna define ourselves in that respect? And so we chose to go the fiscal sponsorship route, which enabled us to kind of acquire philanthropic dollars. And I think that boon of support, first from the Knight Foundation and then from the Ford Foundation, one, it allowed us to pay ourselves. The first 4 years of Art.Black, we were just paying our writers. Then it allowed us to increase our rates. It allowed us to hire at different moments, a third team member to manage social media, the newsletter. It allowed us to then get a copy editor, which is really important because we were doing that work. And we are not copy editors ourselves, so,
We love you, copy editors.
Yes, please always pay your copy editors and pay them well. But I think that influx of liquid just allowed us to take a few more risks. It also allowed us, and I know that we'll talk about this later, to slow down a little bit. We felt that we really had to punch above our weight, but we didn't know how to do that without actual financial support. And so the philanthropic model, while not perfect, I do think it allows smaller digital publications to kind of hold their own and, in some respect, try and do that according to an ethos that may not necessarily be shared by a wider field.
And I want to just stay with you for a minute to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that. Did you have to then produce a certain amount, or was there any kind of exchange for the foundation funding that you got?
Yeah, so the first grant was a matching grant, which we really needed that first amount. It was $15,000. But I also think matching grants are really tricky because it assumes that you also have a community that can help you match the grant, right? And so we really struggled to hit that mark and had to have a lot of hard conversations, I think, with the Knight Foundation about just the inequity of the model itself as a funding model. With Ford, we were kind of allowed to retain our autonomy and agency. And I think that it's not a perfect model, right? What do you do when the institution that's giving you money maybe espouses ideas that you personally don't agree with. Like, how do you negotiate those things? And I don't know that I have a perfect answer for it, but we pretty much got to do our own thing, which was really important.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier when we were talking that to generate funds from the matching grant that you were like got into merch for a minute. And that, obviously if you're pursuing a merch drop, that's time you're not spending producing editorial. So Brian, Outland is funded by an NFT marketplace that is funded by venture capital. You've talked about how the NFT space has more overlap between the roles of artist and curator and collector and critic than the traditional art world, or at least than the traditional art world will like openly admit and say out loud in a big group of people. How has your thinking changed having gone to Outland from a traditional art magazine?
Sure. First of all, I'm not sure I'd say we're an NFT marketplace in the sense that there's not a site that has a lot of NFTs that people can trade with. Rather, we kind of work with artists one at a time to commission projects that are like sold via minting sites and so on. But yeah, for the moment, it's still like venture capital, which can be like a scary thing. The venture capital model, as we've seen in the last decade, isn't always great for media, and there's things I push back on, like if I'm told, oh, we need to like grow the audience. I know from my experience in art media that trying to grow an audience for art criticism is a losing battle. And when Outland launched, like almost immediately I was seeing similar numbers to what we had at Art in America, like maybe a few hundred people read a review, maybe a few thousand people read like a more synthetic essay that's making a strong argument. And so I feel pretty good about the traffic we get. And so I kind of have to make the argument, what matters is like the reputation. Like we get all these requests for like media partnerships, doing events at different like NFT conferences or art fairs, and that is how like we get our name out there and become more established rather than like getting a lot of clicks, because that's not the kind of like publishing I'm interested in doing or capable of doing, to be honest. So I think that's the business model. As for what you were saying about collectors, artists, and critics. I guess, when I started the job, I was like, okay, this is content marketing, right? But then as I started doing it, it's like, well, I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense. I think we're kind of familiar with this art and tech paradigm that was developed in the 60s through like Rauschenberg and Billy Kluver's EAT, or like Bell Labs residencies, where the corporation becomes a tech company becomes a patron of the arts as a way to sort of burnish their reputation and also get artists to play with the tools that they're developing and like do some R&D. And that still exists in like the Google's Artists and Machine Intelligence program or Microsoft's R&D. But Outland is one of these like Web3 startups where art and culture are the product rather than like the art and culture being something that is like a halo around the product. So it is a really different way of approaching that, and something that I hadn't really understood, I think, before I started working there.
Do you think that the venture capital people thought that art criticism would get a lot of hits?
I don't know. I don't know. I think maybe they thought, there would just be articles that are like teaching people what NFTs are, but I don't know. I didn't want to publish that either.
So, Alison, Gagosian Quarterly is supported by the gallery. Obviously, it is a product of the gallery, but it also attracts a lot of advertising. It's like a thick book. It's got the kind of advertising that you see in Vogue. The back cover, I think, of the most recent one is Tiffany. So can you talk about the economics of the project and the revenue relationship?
So I have different pressures than traditional art media. I feel fortunate, actually, in that regard, that we have a lot of freedom in what we can do. I would say, yes, we do accept ad revenue. We approach it as a sustainable business model, but it is very much reliant on the gallery. In the sense that we share staff, we share offices. It's a part of what we bring to the artists that we work with. But I'm able to do long form content, video production for online magazine, and we don't, we sell paintings as a gallery, and so while we do have a solid number of subscriptions and ad revenue coming in, it's really about ultimately our primary business model and about reaching a wider audience that sometimes I think feels like the gallery is unapproachable. And so our challenges are different. And yeah, I guess that's probably the best way to say it.
Well, it's interesting to me because, I mean, you do really talk about it as part of a kind of holistic branding exercise. Like, you're not talking about it as a journalistic thing, and then actually we'll get into that in the next question. But it also does attract advertising. I mean, is it profitable as its own thing?
I wouldn't say it's break even kind of a thing. But if you consider sort of what we're able to do in addition to that for the artists, then it's definitely a huge profitable. It's a good thing for the gallery to be doing.
Mm-hmm. And it is. I mean, the thing that has been notable to me about this, I mentioned this to you when we talked, is that I was in a coffee shop in Savannah, Georgia, like a fancy coffee shop with like a cute jewelry store attached to it, and they had a few different magazines on the wall, and the only art magazine was Gagosian magazine. And I was like, I'm in Savannah, like how did it find me here? So the distribution is really strong, and you said that part of that came from the fact that staff came from magazines that have closed that had really strong relationships to distributors. Can you talk a little bit about that and the kind of entrenched knowledge that you've built there?
Yeah, I mean, we have people on our staff who worked at Vanity Fair, who worked at V Magazine. We work with distributors who are really good at magazines. We're in airports, we're in VIP lounges, we're at train stations. But again, this is all about really getting our artist message into the world and doing that as effectively as possible. So we do try to I didn't know we were in a coffee shop in Savannah. That was a surprise to me, pleasantly. But it's all part of extending the brand reach to as many people as possible.
So, we have seen in the last decade for sure, maybe more so in the last 5 years, the traditional boundaries of art media collapse. There's news organizations might write about advertisers without designating it as sponsored content. At the same time, really established journalists might be writing for organizations run by art businesses. And so I want to pick up a little bit on the question that the issue that you raised, Brian, which is how would you articulate the difference between, content marketing, branding, and journalism in the context of the arts, and how important to you is that distinction? And Brian, maybe since you broached this, we can start with you.
Yeah, this is a tough question. I feel like I would need to know a lot more about content marketing and branding to really answer properly, but it's just like, I don't know if I already said this, but like when I started working at Outland, I got a book on content marketing at the library, and I read it. I was like, well, this isn't what I'm doing.
Wait, did you really?
I did, yeah. Content marketing for dummies. Why not? It always helps to read. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think we're living in the 21st century when media has lost a lot of trust, and people just sort of gravitate towards outlets that they feel like match their worldview, and in the best case scenario, they are aware of their own biases and the publication's biases, but oftentimes they're not. So I think something like Outland is well, I recently spoke to someone who works for this NFT Collectors Club, and he's sort of sort of works with people and sort of helps put his installations in different museums, and he sort of compared what they're doing for digital art to what Uli Sig did for Chinese art, they're activist collectors, and that kind of helped me understand maybe what we're doing in a similar way, we are kind of just cheerleaders for digital art more broadly, and so in that way, but it's also a kind of focus of what we're covering in addition to something we're just marketing, So yeah, I think those lines are really blurry, but I think I would defer to like an expert on these terms to really define what I would love to talk to someone if anyone in the audience knows.
I feel like Alison might know.
Oh my goodness, no content marketing? I mean, lines are also being blurred between auctions, galleries, museums. It's not exclusive to publishing. And I think it's just about being adaptable and finding new ways of reaching an audience, whether, if you're doing something on social media that's content driven, then just making it short form, having it be a series, really just adapting your story to the platform and the reach. And I just say, of course, we need criticism and journalism, and the path forward for that, I think, was the last panel. But it's about, there was a moment in history where critics really defined what was happening in the art world. Clement Greenberg really championed artists, and I think that artists always need a champion to have their message heard, and I think sometimes that's a gallerist and sometimes that's a critic, and we play a role in that, but I'm not sure. I think that you have to be adaptable to the times, I think is what I'm saying. And I think that this change is happening. It's very widespread, especially within the art world.
Jessica, what do you think?
I mean, I certainly am also not an expert on content marketing. I think this question brings to mind for me is like Art.Black emerging post-Great Recession as media has like imploded and changed in a lot of ways. And while I don't believe we are content marketers, I think I saw and have been in community with writers and editors who were also trying to like materially stay afloat. And so the blur too, for me, is, I guess I hear this question, I think about, well, how are people like paying their bills? And I try not to begrudge folks who have to make decisions about the terms or kind of modes and genres of their work, because media is, it's a mess right now. Art.Black certainly published and took a position that we wanted folks who may not necessarily identify as quote unquote critics or even journalists to be able to say something thoughtful back to a world and apparatus of cultural production that they were interacting with. But I think so much about like, what does it take for people to just stay afloat, especially in a city like New York or Los Angeles or whatever. And I don't know, maybe the answer is also just as messy as the blur, but some part of me has deep sympathy for the negotiations people have to make who maybe want to write in a way that is not materially possible for them. I don't know, perhaps that's also an excuse or a cop-out. I'm willing to take that, but I think a lot about just the kind of material consequences of moving across these nebulous categories.
Yeah, well, and I think, if I had to, gun to my head, make a distinction between journalism and content marketing, it would be about who's paying, right? It's about who's paying and what is the kind of ultimate end goal. Like, is it just to exist and have people read it? Or is it, maybe it's furthering another aim? I think even those things have gotten really blurry. But I think, Brian, one thing you said when we spoke ahead of this was that coming into this, you were really concerned about, an appearance of sort of conflict or, coming from a fairly straightforward structure of art in America. And once you got there, you felt differently.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big thing in the NFT space is that it really is so financialized. That's just the reality of it. And I just felt like I don't really understand it unless I like get my MetaMask wallet and buy some NFTs and understand that side of it. And so I started collecting, and I ended up, earlier this year I wrote a piece about an artist who I'd bought a work from, and like that would have been such a taboo at art in America, right? You can't do that, and yet in this case, like I went to this sort of like live minting interactive performance, and I was like, maybe I'll just observe it, but then I was like, no, I'm not really gonna like really understand the piece unless I participated. It's sort of like trying to write about a play just by looking at reading the script and looking at some shots of the stage without actually going into the theater. So I did that, and then I kind of acknowledged it, and on Twitter I wrote this thread about like, oh yeah, I collected this piece, and like it's so complicated, and this is why I did it, blah, blah, blah. And, like, no one cared. Like, I thought maybe someone would say, like, at least one person would say, oh, God, that's so bad. Like, how could you do that? But, like, people don't
I read
care.
that. I read it. It's a really great thread, but you can see yourself kind of, like, working through this and like, working yourself up, and then the replies are just like, thanks for sharing.
Thanks for your input, yeah.
And, I mean, that kind of brings me to the next question, which is, do you feel like audiences are thinking more when they make choices about what to read about the individual writer or the publication? And do you think that that has changed over time? Maybe, Alison, we'll start with you.
I can think of examples historically where I would have picked up, for instance, a magazine because of either a writer that I was interested in particularly, or a photographer, maybe Richard Avedon, something like that. I think that's clear. For us, like, we've never censored a writer. I just kind of want to say that. Like, we're not, and I think, we're bringing in the best person for the best story. I think there are certainly columns that we do serially where we're trying to reach maybe a specific audience who's concerned with legacy building for an artist, or the market, or philanthropy. And so I think that's kind of how we address, people coming back to us, looking for something that they've seen before, but we don't rely heavily on individual writers or voices.
Do you find that different people come to you based on, like, you guys have run, you've run something by, like, the novelist Rachel Cusk, like, or do you find that people come to you via writer? Is that kind of part of the strategy, or is it really more about building an overall ethos and having those writers as sort of part of it?
It's about building an ethos. It's also about building something I want to read, that I think other people will want to read, that people will engage with and come back to. When we make the issue, I often think about artists, and as our main audience, what would an artist want to read when they picked up our magazine? Also writers, also people who are running estates and foundations of artists as our primary audience. I think one of our biggest challenges is really trying to make art more mainstream. Like, if you think about music, if you think about film, so many other art forms are much more widely appreciated. And I think the magazine for us is a way that we can reach into that wider audience, but also bring some of this cross collaboration with artists and other mediums together and celebrate it.
I want to make sure I remember this correctly, but did you say to me that that like new interns coming into the gallery, often their first interaction with Gagosian was through the magazine?
It happens kind of a lot. That actually
That's
people,
crazy
that our brand stands out to them from other brands because of the magazine, because it's something they bring home, they live with it, they refer back to it, they subscribe sometimes, yeah.
And so, Jessica, in terms of, I wonder how this idea of the individual writer versus the kind of institutional voice affected the way that you went about things at Art Stop Black, because obviously Art Stop Black didn't exist before you made it.
Yeah, so like I said, I grew up as a writer with Art Stop Black and eventually stopped writing for the site, but I think we were in a unique position because most of the writers we were publishing were kind of young-ish, right? Like this 25 to early 30s age. And I think a lot of folks were reading us because they didn't know where else to find other Black critics. And for us, that actually was important because we thought we could be able to serve as like a training ground for whatever knowledge we had or were acquiring in the process. We wanted folks to be able to come to us with stories that they couldn't like land elsewhere. And we also wanted them to move out into other publications, because the point is that Black writers have always had something complicated to say about the art that they were interacting with. And the kind of imbalance that I think we were witnessing between the way Black visual artists kind of acquired a certain cultural capital vis-a-vis the way Black writers in the visual arts space were still kind of being ignored. Like, that was a real imbalance for us. And so I think folks were coming to Art Stop Black because they were like, oh, who should we try to publish next, right? And I'm not necessarily like insulted by that. I feel really proud of that because I think a lot of folks got to do some really fun things with us, and also got to kind of go other places and like fly and soar and all these cliche words. But that really matters to me, because I think we, at the end of the day, are also interested in like an ecosystem in which like Black textual production and Black thought can be taken seriously. It's rigorous, it's imaginative, it's playful, it's all of those things too.
Well, and it's interesting too when we think about new models, like is one model, and it's probably not new because nothing is new, but is one new model something that intentionally exists for a certain period of time, where we say, okay, we exist to do this thing in this moment when it's needed, and then we hope to put ourselves out of business in a way?
Yeah, maybe. I don't think we thought about it in those explicit terms, but we certainly haven't. I mean, we've been on hiatus for the past couple of years, some of that informed by personal shifts that Taylor and I have had, but also folks were out. Like the landscape does look different in 2023 than it does in 2014, and I think a small part of that is informed by the work that we have done.
And Brian, for you, in terms of audience and sort of individual writer versus the ethos of a publication, I have no idea how that exists in like the digital art NFT space.
Yeah, I mean, I think our audience comes more for like the subject matter rather than for individual writers. I don't think there are a lot of like superstar art critics who are really seriously thinking about digital art. So, but one thing we've started doing this year is having guest editors where we'll bring someone in, and for like a month or so they'll define a theme, and I'll just sort of talk to them about like what artists should we cover, what ideas are we going to cover, and so that gives a way to structure it and sort of like start some more conversations about it. And like in the newsletter, I sort of give some more context to the projects we're doing. Like currently we're working with Refraction DAO, which is an organization that puts on like festivals of digital art and music, and they're really interested in decentralized forms of governance. They have a membership that works together to like distribute funds to various projects, and so we've written, been covering these ideas about how do you design a community and use these tools, and like where the tools fall short and so on. So in that way, I think that's one of the ways in which we've tried to, I guess like define what we're covering and sort of give people like topics and things to go there from, and also like bring in these other communities to our site through the guest editors.
And I want to make sure that we have time to talk about new models that excite you, maybe ones that you've seen that are starting, certain publications you want to flag, or ideas of ways that art publishing could exist and doesn't yet. So Jessica, maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, okay. Who am I reading? Well, I read Burnaway, which is a magazine of the South. I think it's really important regionally, and yeah, I just have a lot of respect for what they're doing. I read Contemporary which has been like a sister publication to Arts.Black in a lot of ways. Yvette and Julia have really shifted, I think, a conversation around supporting Black artists. And they're based in Berlin, but they also have an outpost that's focused on the Americas, which I think is really important. I read Guts magazine, which is a Canadian journal. Obviously, I think Momus is doing some really exciting things. But I also want to shout out a forthcoming publication, Jupiter magazine, that will be launched by Daria and Camille, because I think, too, they're trying to think seriously about pace and support, and, yeah, a new kind of contingency of Black writers, so that I think that's always exciting to me. And then I learned about a publication in Melbourne, Unprojects, which I wanted to shout out to because I've been kind of going in a rabbit hole about them. So.
And I don't know the models of all of those, but I do know that Burnaway is a 501c3,
yes,
right?
It is, and Contemporary as well.
And Brian, what about you? Are there certain experimental ways of structuring publications that you think we could imagine?
Yeah, imagine is the key word here because I don't think they exist yet. But I just mentioned Refraction, and I think that model of the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization, could be really interesting because there are a few others like that, like Black Swan, which is based in Berlin and is now like working on incubating similar ones in other cities around the world. But these are organizations where decisions made about how to distribute arts funding are made by artists and art workers who are active in the community rather than like patrons and foundations. And all of the kind of mechanisms of distribution and the tallying of the votes is sort of like automated and transparent using blockchain tools. And I think that could be effective for criticism because it is, something that like a fairly small number of people care about, but having those people, make those decisions about what to publish, I think that could be exciting. I think Outland still functions like a pretty much traditional magazine in that way, but it's something we could explore in the future, and I'm trying to learn more about it myself. But I think there are also organizations kind of doing that already using things like Patreon, like the White Pube in England, or Do Not Research, which is Joshua Cittarella's project, or New Models, which we stole their name for this panel. And they kind of have these, like they raise funds through Patreon, and I know White Pube sort of distributes that money back through creative grants to artists. And Do Not Research, there's like an active community on Discord of young writers who like get paid for their work in that way. So people call that like Web 2.5, I guess. And so I think there are promising possibilities that hopefully might be realized in the next decade.
And I want to talk, as we approach time, I want to talk briefly about time. I come from digital media where, we had to publish a story probably every hour, if not more, just to kind of keep at the pace that we needed to for traffic, for advertising, for all of those things. And you all of you, operate on a very different timeline than that. And I think that when we talk about kind of cleaving away from an advertising model and what that would look like, that's a real shift. And so I'm curious about sort of how you operating on a different pace that is not a digital media pace informs what you do and maybe is a driver in what you do. We'll start with you. Yeah.
I am so glad not to operate on that pace. Thank you very much. Sorry, I totally interrupted. But no, I mean, I think what's really great is being able to publish only 4 times a year, to be able to put really quality, long-form content together, and also to be able to, we're talking really primarily about writing, but I think that, video is actually, and there's other, talk radio, podcasts, all of this stuff is other ways of kind of getting this into the world. Sorry, but I interrupted you. The question
I think we were too broke to move any faster than the way we were moving because we were working full-time jobs in the beginning. And so it was just like, oh, there's a pitch in, confirming receipt and talking to the author, like, this is how quickly we could do this, and a lot of our writing initially wasn't necessarily pegged to like a specific exhibition, or we tried to find ways for the writing to live beyond the life of an exhibition or a show itself. As we kind of acquired more philanthropic dollars, I think the challenge became the fact that Taylor and I never lived in the same city as we were doing this, so pace was also informed by our distance, both as friends and collaborators. So slow was really the only way we could actually make a thing that we were proud of.
Yeah, it's either like you don't have enough money to go fast or you have enough money to go slow. And okay, I want to end so that we have time for questions with a thought experiment. So if I have $10 million and I want to give it to each of you. I have $30 million and I'm going to give you each 10 to address a hole or a flaw that you see in the art media landscape today. So how are you going to spend it? Let's start with Brian and we'll go down the line.
You know how they have those like TikTok hype houses? I would do that for critics. I mean, not necessarily like putting stuff on TikTok, but I just feel like a problem with a lot of art media, especially in the digital media landscape where things are happening fast. I mean, not including Alan because we work at a slower pace, but it's like a writer sends something to an editor and maybe there are minimal changes. It goes online, like nobody talks about it, if people do talk about it, it's probably for the wrong reasons, like the writer is getting canceled or something. And I feel like that kind of conversation is really important to helping writers develop and to help make better discourse. So it would just be nice to have like a place where writers, actually now I'm thinking about writers living together and it could be awful, but I guess a residency maybe or something where people can like exchange ideas, because also like the sort of outlets I mentioned before, like Do Not Research or White People, they're really focused on like kind of collaboration and conversation. I feel like the Substack model, where it's like one person writing a newsletter and getting money for that, like it's not really going to push the discourse in any meaningful way because it is so isolated, and our culture in general is very atomizing and isolating. So I feel like making spaces where people can like workshop ideas and talk about their work would be a good way to spend $10 million.
I would love to spend $10 million on community building, but I think if that money's really going to make money, you have to really appreciate what the audience is giving you, which is their time and attention. And I think you have to return it with quality content. And I think in the future, that's going to be, you know, maybe more entertaining than, you know, you have to give someone back something while they're giving you their attention. I think sometimes that's about, you know, bringing together art and music and having them pay, you know, play music while you're also like looking at artwork or talking about artwork or something. There's got to be some hybridization of, I think, sort of collaborations across different types of art making to keep people interested.
I like this question because it's one that I think a lot about as part of Critical Minded, which is a group that supports critics of color across kind of multiple beats, if you will. I would just give money to writers. I think so many of the folks that I'm in community with like are just trying to keep their head above water. They don't necessarily want to be on staff, but like maybe they have the research project that they want to, you know, like I had a research project that I wanted to kind of go long on. Maybe they're like artist books that they want to kind of think about, you know, like I want artists and writers as artists to feel like they don't have to make compromises in order to like live and live well. And I think I trust writers, most writers, to figure out like what the outcomes need to be, if there needs to be an outcome driven model at all. So I give it away to them. Yeah.
All right, question time. Anybody have questions? Start with you.
I kind of sort of have a question. I have my own online publication that features work of Black photographic artists globally, but at the same time holds an artist first. And as we all should know by now, art school does not teach people learning to be better artists how to be entrepreneurs at the same time. So I think running it by myself for the past 2+ years has just felt a little bit stagnant in terms of growth. So in terms of new models, how can someone like myself make it sustainable money-wise? Or beyond that as well?
I guess I would ask you, like, well, like how are you defining sustainable? Like, is it the thing you want to be full-time work for you? Like, do you want a team, you know, like, in full transparency, like Taylor and I have just now gotten a third person, and I think the philanthropic model, though not perfect, is the route we went because we knew that we could continue to make arguments for like some sort of structural capital, but we also work jobs along the way, you know.
Is there a way to sell the work that you're presenting on the website?
I have been told to consider prints
Yeah.
of the artists that I do feature. So that has an idea to me.
I think that might be an interesting way to finance it and also sort of stick with the trajectory you initiated. Is selling the work and figuring out how to edition it and then, you know, creating a community around what you're doing that's interested in acquiring works and yeah.
Produce it, particularly, to get the money in hand before you have to put the money for production.
I mean, that's sort of how Aperture works, right? They produce photo books and sell them. So.
Ben, you had a question.
Really inspiring panel, really, very different angles on one problem. I guess what I wanted to ask all of you, think about audience again. How honest do you think any of your audiences are, or just the art audiences itself, with its own desires? Because I find that people talk a lot of high-minded stuff about what they want, and that's just empirically not true, and it can be very disheartening when you're publishing stuff, when it's I'm trying to I feel like every 5 years another small journal is launched that has the same mission. It's we are taking a stand against the click-driven world and a return to the passionate, really passionate, convicted criticism. And then after a couple of years, people find that people don't actually show up for that, and that's disheartening to them, and they give up on it. So, you're all stuck it out in different kinds of ways, and to a certain extent, I think that involves being realistic about, in a project that's bigger than just the immediate feedback you're giving. But in terms of your audience, how honest do you think people are about what they say they want and what they show up for?
We can really put out the best version of a magazine that we feel should exist in the world. And, again, I have the benefit of having artists who are making decisions about what they want to say to the world and not necessarily always listening to what the reader wants. And so I think it's our job to really transmit their message in the best possible way. And as far as some of the other content we're putting together, we're sort of using ourselves as a test for what we want in the world, what we think we'd want to read. And it's happened to me where people said, I picked up the magazine and I thought it was really just going to be about propaganda on behalf of the gallery, and it's actually much more. And that's a great compliment to us, because that's really what we're trying to do. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think with a magazine, no one ever reads the whole thing cover to cover, and people will just like to be a part of the readership, be a part of the community, even if they're not reading everything or reading anything. I think people have ideas about why criticism matters, and they like that it exists, even if they only read a couple of things a year. And I don't think that's necessarily being dishonest. It's just more yeah.
I think there were certain people who I would encounter in the world who said, I really like what you all are doing at Arts.Black. And I think, in full transparency, some of that was a consequence of this white liberalism, right? I think people were I need to be reading Black folks, so that's why I'm going to Arts.Black. Congratulations, Jessica. I think there are also people who really understood what it was that we were trying to do, and were behind that in a very earnest way. And I think we knew that we weren't gonna be getting the 1 million unique viewers or visitors a month, but I think we were aware that folks coming to the site would mostly fall in those two categories, and I made my peace with that.
I guess I'd also say, when I go to NFT events, art and tech events, people are always telling me, oh yeah, I love Outland, whereas no one ever told me that they love art in America. It was just taken for granted that it was there. But because it is doing something different and filling a gap, there is appreciation for that, even though I'm sure that most of the people who say that don't read everything we publish, but they they're having it there. This is also something we talked about at Art in America too. It's we have almost 1 million followers on Twitter, but our engagement is much lower, and social media, you're sort of building this audience that there are different levels of engagement, and some people are actually reading and really care about it, and other people just like to know that it's there, and I think that's all great.
I would just quickly chime in to say, like, I do think, having seen the numbers, yes, people are dishonest sometimes about what I am. Like, I go to the New York Times and I'm, like, supposed to be reading about Ukraine, but I read about Meghan and Harry because it's right there. Like, we all do this, and I think digital media organizations capitalize on that. Like, they capitalize on the moment when I go to read about Ukraine, but I choose Meghan and Harry for sure. And I'm going to probably stay longer on that story than I would, because my brain is broken, and all of our brains are broken in that way. And so I think, I don't know, something that you said really, Brian, kind of like opened up a door for me a second ago, which is that illness path is like going to exist. Like, that is the way that digital media functions right now, and maybe the other pathway is a community building pathway. So it's maybe you don't, like, jump online in the morning to, like, read the 1,200 word review or some other version, but you want to be part of that community that produces that supports that cares about that, and so you support it in other ways. Yeah.
Given everyone's kind of unique funding structure, has there been a moment where you've been asked to compromise from an editorial perspective, and then how did you deal with that?
I haven't, and that's a great privilege, I have to say. I'm sure it's not the case with most traditional media.
I think we haven't, but I think a lot of the things that we negotiated early on were, like, how honest can we be and not be, like, blacklisted from a world that barely knows how to see us as, like, two Black women critics anyway? Like, how truthful can we be? And I think that's like a really honest fear. And not on this, like, we haven't had to kind of compromise on the site, but I know that I have not said things in ways that I probably would re-say now if I wasn't so afraid back then. And I think very few critics understand that position or have to even negotiate that position.
I don't think so. I mean, I have a lot of independence, and sometimes, like, my colleagues will say, oh, we should cover this, and I'll just be like, yeah, sure, fine. I feel like, anytime you're an editor, you're going to end up working on stories that maybe you're not, like, the most excited about. But, I like to have, like, a broad range of stuff covered, so I don't really feel like I'm making compromises. It's just more like being collaborative and being open to lots of different ideas.
I would say, as an editor, for sure, yes. It happens all the time. I mean, there's macro stuff and there's micro stuff, right? There's how do you build a website that is going to be, like, can stay alive, and those questions come up all the time. And I think for me, it was really, like, I would just ask myself, like, is this one I can live with? And sometimes the answer was yes, and sometimes the answer was no, and those are the battles that I would fight. But yeah, I mean, I had to ask myself that question all the time.
And I guess argument falls within that too, because it's, I mean, you did do traditional advertising there, but it's also funded by the gallery network, so it's similar.
Yeah. Any other questions? We've got time for one more, if one more question remains. Yes.
I wanted to go back to something Alison said earlier about the mission of making art more mainstream and using film and music as kind of a comparison to that, because that seems like a really complicated idea in that film and music are, in the current mode, like, much more distributable and pluralistic in terms of the way you can receive and live with them at, like, a much lower price point. And I just wonder if that's something you've been thinking about and how you square that with the mission of making art more mainstream.
Well, it's very expensive to do that. I mean, to make a film with music and art. And so I think that's why I'm going to use the $10 million that way, for one thing. I think a little bit it's about maybe this is a funny thing to say, but like tricking people into really like learning more about art by making it really entertaining and interesting in ways that you wouldn't expect if it's super scholarly and like something you have to read or something you feel like you need to read to be informed. And I think there's a power in that, in sort of getting to that audience and entertaining them as much as you're giving them new information. And I do kind of really, it's a huge ambition, but to be able to really widen the reach of the art, the impact that artists are able to make by being able to get inside people's homes with something, you know, like a film or you know, that sort of, that you encounter in a very intimate, domestic way. It's in your personal space, and it could be a very meaningful engagement with audience that would be memorable and that they'd carry into the future and maybe ultimately want to, you know, engage further with the artist.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to our panelists.